Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Natan Meir. I'm the academic director of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. And I'm also the Laurie Low-Key Professor of Judaic Studies. Before we proceed, I'm going to read a statement that is recommended by PSU's Event Disruption Protocol. This event was scheduled and organized by the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. We expect all attendees to conduct themselves in such a way that the program is not disrupted. A disruption is conduct that interferes with the speaker or with the speaker's ability to conduct the scheduled event, or interference that blocks the audience from seeing, hearing, or participating in the event. If an attendee behaves in such a way that prevents audience members from hearing, seeing, or participating in the scheduled event, they may be asked to stop or to leave the event. That is the end of the statement. Now on to our program. Given the events of the last few weeks in Israel and Gaza, and especially the horrific terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas on Israelis on October 7th, we, as scholars in the field of Jewish studies, felt that it was important for us to draw on our own academic expertise to shed some light on the situation. I want to call your attention as we begin to the disclaimer that we included with all the publicity for the event. Quote, "This event is not meant to be an explainer of the immediate causes of the war and will not provide detailed explanations of the history or geopolitics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict," end quote. We did receive some pushback on this from folks who felt that any panel on the current crisis had to try to explain the background behind the war and ultimately the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a whole. I don't think any of us wants to be here for the next 7 or 8 hours, which is probably just the beginning of what that would take. But more than that, that would be irresponsible on our part. All of us are experts in various aspects of Jewish civilization, culture, and society, including Jewish thought, society and thought in antiquity, Jewish literature, Jewish Israeli culture, and modern Jewish social and cultural history. These are the fields of expertise that we bring to bear today. And I hope it goes without saying, although I'll say it, that any scholarly panel on the long and complex history of Israeli-Palestinian relations would have to include an expert or experts on Palestinian society and history. Many such events have recently taken place at universities across the country and continue to be organized. And I believe that our own Middle East Studies Center at PSU is in the midst of putting together some kind of explainer event. So make sure that you're on their mailing list if you want to be notified of that event when it happens. Also, there's a possibility that this event today, which is going to be recorded, will be a part of a one-credit course that Judaic Studies will put together, and we're not quite sure what that would look like, but we'll send out more information about that in the future if you're interested. I want to acknowledge that this event is taking place at a moment of elevated tensions on many campuses, including ours. Many members of the PSU campus community, including students, staff, and faculty, are feeling a complex mix of emotions: grief, pain, anger, uneasiness. Some fear for their safety on campus. The university administration is aware of these tensions and will take steps, I hope, to ease them. If you need help, please let us know so we can connect you with the appropriate resources. Our event today will proceed as follows. Each faculty member will have about 8 or 9 minutes to give a short talk. We'll then have a Q&A period. Please write your questions on the pieces of paper that we've placed on the chairs and pass them to the front. If you need a pen, our office coordinator, Vicky Mazzone, has them at the back. And feel free to start passing questions forward as we are talking. I'll also point out that Vicky has, there's a sign-in sheet in the back as well for people who would like to sign in, and we have some course flyers for upcoming Judaic Studies courses as well. So the order will be as follows. To my left, Lauren Spielman, Associate Professor of Classical Judaism, will speak on attitudes towards captives in classical Jewish texts. I will then talk about how we might contextualize this moment in the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence. Nina Spiegel, at the end of the row, Rabbi Joshua Stamfer, Associate Professor of Israel Studies, will speak on the role of trauma in Israeli Jewish society. And finally, Michael Weingrad, Professor of Judaic Studies, will present two literary texts that speak to the current moment. You should have received a handout with the texts, and I think if you haven't, I think there are some extras at the back. Finally, I want to thank the Judaic Studies Office Coordinator, Vicky Mazzone, for her help in organizing this event. And of course, my colleagues for their dedication and commitment to our shared mission. Professor Spielman?
Yes. Thank you. My name is Professor Lawrence Spielman, and I am the Associate Professor of Classical and Rabbinic Judaism at PSU. And I want to speak for a few moments about some of the ancient rabbinic values that undergird the Jewish responses to the tragic events of October 7th. As a recent article in Commentary Magazine, written by my colleagues Avital Davidovich Eshed, Chaim Weiss, Ishai Rosenzvi, Yuval Rautman, and James Adam Redfield, points out, at the current moment, more than 200 children, elderly people, women, and men are held hostage in Gaza, and the question of negotiating for their release is the subject of considerable political debate. These scholars outline the extent to which ransoming captives has always been a fundamental Jewish value that developed more importance through the ages, an importance that is expressed not only in daily Jewish prayer, which praises God as the freer of captives, but in several central Jewish texts. The principle of Pidyon Shvu'im, or the redemption of captives, is considered to be a mitzvah rabbah, or a supreme commandment, in most classical rabbinic texts. Several texts consider the commandment to ransom for captured prisoners to outweigh the performance of other core Jewish obligations, such as observing the Sabbath or avoiding places where idolatrous worship might occur. An overarching principle of rabbinic Judaism holds that we are unable to determine whose blood is redder, and therefore every potential opportunity to avoid taking a life, even at the cost of surrendering one's own life, should be entertained. Captivity was considered among the most terrible forms of punishment, with prisoners suspected of being subject to various forms of torture and sexual violence. Gender, therefore, played a significant role in anxieties about the fate of captives, and the freeing of women or children who had been seized was deemed a priority. Captives were generally considered to still be alive unless proven dead, which delays the ability to properly mourn or to allow women to remarry, potentially creating difficulties in determining paternity of offspring. The Mishnah, a compendium of Jewish law from the land of Israel, concluded in the early 3rd century CE, is the first Jewish text to explicitly present the freeing of captives as a core Jewish value, although it does place limits on the extent to which it should be pursued. The Mishnah states, captives are not redeemed for more than their value, for the betterment of the world, and one may not aid the captive's escape for the betterment of the world. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, for the betterment of the captives. The idea that one can apply a monetary value to captives seems to come from the logic elsewhere in this tractate, which discusses the redemption of slaves, another form of freedom which requires a ransom payment. And the reasoning at work in the phrase, for the betterment of the world, seems to be the realization that by paying excessive ransoms for prisoners, one might encourage the taking of hostages as a practice. So too, according to Maimonides' commentary on this Mishnah, aiding the prisoners in an escape might cause the captors to treat their captives more harshly, by placing iron chains on the prisoners who remain, or subjecting them to other forms of torture and punishment. This principle of avoiding overpaying for hostages has become a touch point in contemporary discussion of the release of hostages in the present conflict, and mirrors the concern among modern state actors that entertaining ransom demands of any sort encourages hostage taking as a tactic of terror. This is, however, a misreading of the Mishnah, as it ignores the overriding rabbinic mandate to see to the return of hostages. In context, this law serves as a reminder that despite the seriousness of the rabbinic commitment to seeing to the safe return of captives, one should do so within the means of the community and not become discouraged when the demands for the safe return of co-religionists becomes too high. Note that the rabbis discourage any sort of attempt to free prisoners by force or military stratagem, as this is seen as equally, if not more dangerous, to both the public welfare and the welfare of any remaining captives. In all the opinions mentioned thus far in the Mishnah and its commentators, the concern for the welfare of the captives and their safe return outweighs any anxieties about giving in to the demands of kidnappers, and there is never a consideration that one ought not to pay any price at all for the return of prisoners. In fact, as the authors of this article make clear, many stories from the Talmud's commentary stress that the plight of individual captives often requires going to extremes to secure their return no matter the price, with an emphasis on seeing to the return of children and female captives. The Babylonian Talmud tells a gruesome tale of the exceedingly beautiful woman named Safnat bat Peniel, who is seized, sexually violated by her captors, and placed on the auction block for sale as a slave. In the midst of her humiliation, she cries out to God, "Master of the universe, even if you have shown no pity to us, why have you not shown pity to the sanctity of your mighty name?" In her pain, she blames God for the failure of her redemption from captivity, and she refers to her plight as a captive as a desecration of not only her body, but of God's sanctity. Following her story, we find the story of a captive redeemed by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania. He is a young and handsome Torah savant imprisoned in Rome. Rabbi Yehoshua notes the boy's brilliance and makes an oath to stand in protest until the boy is redeemed, notably no matter what sum they put on his head. Therefore, in open defiance of the Mishnah cited above. Another story is told of the wealthy Levi Bar Darga, who redeems his daughter when she is taken captive with 13,000 gold dinar, an exorbitant sum, which leaves commentators of the Talmud with the impression that the Mishnah's limits on paying ransoms do not apply to wealthy individuals or organizations with considerable resources. According to Davidovich Eshed et al., during the Middle Ages, the ethos of redeeming captives increasingly became a principle of communal and intercommunal life. Documentary evidence from the Cairo Geniza, a repository of Jewish documents that survived miraculously for 1,500 years, demonstrates the lengths to which Jewish communities were willing to go to collect funds for the payment of ransoms, while the writings of the medieval sage Maimonides suggest that the redemption of captives takes precedence over the feeding and clothing of the poor and stands as the greatest commandment. Jews and Israelis looking at the events of October 7th are informed not only by rabbinic stories of violence against Jews and the horror and anxiety of having been subjected to waves of terror over 2 millennia, which included policies of displacement and death, but also large-scale imprisonment and seizure of captives. They are also called deeply by the ethical urge to see to the redemption of captives, despite great cost and danger, and overwhelming concern for all those who are in bondage and captivity. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. When I teach my survey of Jewish history from the Middle Ages to the present, and I think I see some people who have taken that course here, I always emphasize to my students the positive aspects of Jewish life through thousands of years of existence as a minority among both Christians and Muslims. Jews created thriving communities, developed dynamic cultures of religious scholarship, and played crucial roles in the economic life of cities and countries. I do this deliberately in an attempt to balance the perception many have that Jewish history wasn't much more than a long procession of expulsions and massacres that culminated in the Holocaust. But in order to fully explain this moment and the impact of the attack of October 7th on the consciousness of Israeli Jews and indeed Jews everywhere, we have to focus on the long history of hostility towards Jews, of violent hatred of Jews. So allow me to offer a brief survey of the history of anti-Semitism. If you are interested in a longer survey, you can take the course that I'm offering next term on the history of anti-Semitism. In the Middle Ages, Jews were always seen as the other, as aliens, even when they had lived in a country for hundreds of years. In addition, starting around the 13th century in Christian Europe, they were seen as enemies of Christianity, a theological accusation. Add to that the popular myths about Jews that emerged in the Middle Ages and then circulated widely in the centuries after, myths such as the blood libel, which accused Jews of murdering Christian children so that they could use their blood to bake matzah. The result is a hatred of Jews that was often murderous in its intent and in its effect. What people often don't understand about anti-Semitism is that it's not just hatred of Jews. That's too simplistic. It's hatred of Jews because Jews are perceived as dangerous to humanity and as the embodiment of evil. After all, how could you be truly human and kill children for your religious rights? In the modern period, starting in the 19th century, political ideology entered the equation as well. In the Russian Empire and other parts of Europe, Jews were accused of spreading revolutionary ideologies like socialism and of plotting the downfall of the emperor or the monarch. So now, Jews were the enemy of the nation, whether the Russian, French, German, or some other nation. Because they were perceived to belong to no nation and to not actually be a true nation themselves, anti-Semites accused Jews of using the transnational nature of their existence as a global people to spread corrosive ideologies throughout the West and the whole world. Given the nature of anti-Semitism as I've just described it, it's really not surprising that during the chaos of the Russian Civil War, approximately 1919 to 1921, the armies, militias, and armed bands that were active in Ukraine at the time, and Ukraine was one of the epicenters of activity of fighting during the Russian Civil War. Those militias and armed bands that were active and were seeking an enemy close at hand that could be punished for the ruin into which their country had fallen, they found that enemy in their Jewish neighbors. And in the massacres that followed, which most people do not know about, hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered in the most brutal ways imaginable. Rape, especially public rape, was consistently used as a form of torture and to leave a mark of shame on women and families for life. And survivors literally went out of their minds because of what they had experienced and seen. There was no functioning state or police force to step in to protect the Jews, and anyway, it's not clear that such a force would have consistently protected them. So the anti-Semitism that drove those massacres in 1919, 1920, 1921 had many things in common with Nazi anti-Semitism when it arose a few years later. Nazi anti-Semitism is often described not only as radical anti-Semitism, but also as eliminationist and redemptive. It's an anti-Semitism that states that Jews are the source of evil in the world, and that until they are destroyed, humanity will never be free from the corrosive effect of Jewish existence. And ultimately, their destruction will lead to the redemption of the world. That is also the ideology that motivates both Hamas as an organization and the Hamas terrorists who murdered and tortured Jewish Israelis in unimaginably vicious ways on October 7th. Obviously, the Nazi utopian vision was very different from that of Hamas, but both required and require the elimination of the Jews as a people. The Hamas Charter of 1988 is rooted in genocidal anti-Semitism. It calls, quote unquote, world Zionism one of the main enemies of Islam and calls for its complete destruction. In the massacres of Ukraine that I was just talking about a few minutes ago, and also in the killing fields and the camps of the Holocaust, Jews were helpless. They were abandoned by the states of which they were citizens. They were forsaken by police and other governmental forces that are supposed to defend citizens from violence. Sometimes these policemen even assisted the murderers. And that's exactly why the attack of October 7th is so incredibly painful for Israelis and for all Jews, because it happened in the one place in the world where Jews believed that they would never, that they could never be abandoned to the mercy of a raging mob or the malevolent designs of vicious killers. That place is the Jewish state, which is established in large measure to ensure that Jews would never again be helpless against anti-Jewish violence. One-off terrorist attacks like bus bombings or shootings, yes, those have happened in Israel many times, but they're usually over in minutes, albeit with the loss of many lives. And the police or the army swoop in right away to chase down terrorists and secure the area. But on October 7th, the terrorists were free to terrorize, rape, and murder, to kill parents in front of their children and children in front of their parents, to burn people alive in locked rooms. Why the army was so slow in coming is a question that has yet to be answered. And there is no doubt that many of the Israelis who were attacked fought back bravely, sometimes with their bare hands. But the emotional wound of an onslaught that reminded so many in Israel of genocidal anti-Semitic violence that Jews experienced in the diaspora, that wound is very, very deep, and the scar it has left behind will take many years to heal. Quote, "I'm a child of Holocaust survivors," one Israeli woman told reporters. "I grew up hearing stories of the camps, and I thought those were the worst stories. These stories are worse. And I think that's the hardest thing for me. I never thought I would live to see something worse than the stories I grew up with." I want to conclude by pointing out that the radical anti-Semitism of Hamas is not the ideology that motivates the Palestinian nationalist movement as a whole, and there are many Palestinians who are not anti-Semitic. But also, make no mistake, pro-Palestinian activists, including one of our student groups on the PS2 campus that call for Palestine to be liberated, quote, "from the river to the sea," are not just calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state. They are calling for the destruction of Israel, and along with it, the destruction of all Jews living in Israel. And when they call Israel evil, they're invoking thousands of years of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic hatred that viewed and views the Jews as the epitome and ultimate embodiment of evil in the world. Thank you.
Just waiting for the PowerPoint. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Professor Spiegel, the Rabbi Joshua Stamfer Associate Professor of Israel Studies on campus. Can people hear me in the back? Yeah, okay, great. I want to offer a lens today on Israeli Jewish national culture that looks at the role of trauma. This is a traumatic time. Grief, loss, despair, shock, and a sense of loneliness are all components of the traumatic response. And I will be looking at this manifestation on the collective level today. I want to acknowledge that there's trauma in the Palestinian community as well that I talk about in my courses. Today, I'm going to focus on Israeli Jewish society in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre. I want to take a quick moment to say a few words about the composition of Israeli society. It is diverse and complex. The majority of the Jewish population in Israel today is what would be termed in the US as people of color, including a small number of Jews from Ethiopia and India, as well as large numbers of those from the Middle East and North Africa, countries such as Yemen, Iraq, Morocco, Iran, many of whom were persecuted or expelled from those countries after the State of Israel was established in 1948. The society also includes Jews from Europe and other parts of the world, including Holocaust survivors, as well as those who had a continuous presence in the land over the ages. Approximately 20% of the population are Israeli Palestinian Arabs who are both Muslim and Christian. There are also migrant workers from locations such as Thailand and the Philippines. The society is multifaceted, and my courses explore its many different components. For Israeli Jewish society, the horrific and brutal Hamas massacre that took place on October 7th and the capture and kidnapping of over 200 Israelis, the largest and most ruthless assault against Jews since the Holocaust, was an unbearable trauma that is layered on top of collective traumas that are already an integrated part of Israeli culture and the Israeli national psyche. I'm going to focus today on two national examples. The first is the Holocaust, the core trauma of Israeli society. The Holocaust, the attempt to systematically annihilate all the Jews of Europe, in which 6 million Jews were murdered, left a deep mark on the country and the resolve that never again would this be allowed to happen. One cannot emphasize enough the profound scar of the Holocaust on the Israeli soul. The well-known Hebrew author Amos Elon refers to the characteristic of loneliness and loss that has an indelible mark on the national psychology. The Holocaust looms large in a range of arenas in Israeli society, as Israelis see themselves as the bearers of Holocaust memory and view it as their national responsibility to research, memorialize, and honor the victims. I'm going to focus on two national examples. Yad Vashem is the National Memorial Museum and Center in Jerusalem. As you can see here, a 45-acre campus on the Mount of Remembrance. Literally meaning a monument and a name, it was established in 1953 in the early years of the state. It is a vast campus that includes a museum, a synagogue, a research center, memorials, and educational centers. It is on the itinerary of all foreign dignitaries visiting the country to send the message that one cannot understand Israel without understanding the Holocaust. At the end of the core museum exhibition at the site, the visitor leaves the accounts of the horrors to literally walk into the light and take in a view of the Jerusalem hills. This embodies the Zionist message that out of the ashes of the Holocaust, ending in 1945, came the redemption of the State of Israel, established in 1948. The promise of the state was that never again would this happen to the Jewish people, and never again would they be unable to defend themselves. Yad Vashem is embedded in space in Israel's capital city. Holocaust memory is also embedded in time with a national commemorative holiday in the Israeli national calendar. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, is a full day of remembering. One component of the practices on this day is the standing silent during a 2-minute siren. You see pictured here traffic stopped in the busy city of Tel Aviv with people getting out of their cars for this memorial time. This is embodied memory, and it runs deep. So we see two examples here of Holocaust memory and its trauma ingrained in national space and national time. I want to turn next to Masada, a mountain fortress that served as the last Jewish stronghold in ancient times after the Romans conquered Jerusalem. As historian Yael Zerubbabel describes, this complex story in ancient Jewish history was turned into a central narrative in the shaping of modern Israeli society. While the ancient Jews on Masada did not defeat the Romans, they likewise did not surrender, and the Masada story in the Israeli psyche focuses on the resolve to keep fighting and not give up. Masada, too, is on the itinerary of foreign dignitaries. The Masada complex refers to the mountaintop in its story as a metaphor for the state of Israel itself, lonely and isolated, needing to protect itself on its own to the end. It was expressed in the poem Masada by Yitzhak Lamdan in 1927 with its famous call, "Never again shall Masada fall." When President Biden spoke in Israel last week, he was calming the Israeli Masada complex, the sense of trauma and being alone in the world. When he said, "I come to Israel with a single message. You are not alone. You are not alone. As long as the United States stands, and we will stand forever, we will not let you ever be alone. And the United States isn't going anywhere either. We're going to stand with you. We'll walk beside you in those dark days, and we'll walk beside you in the good days to come. And they will come." This message was not only one of geopolitical support, but struck a deep chord in the Israeli national psyche and the sense of being alone in the world. Thus, a billboard thanking the president was posted in Tel Aviv, exhibiting the deep sense of appreciation. I will conclude with an image and a quote. The country is grappling with how to cope with and process this unbearable trauma. In Jewish tradition, you light a memorial candle to remember loved ones. The image here with the symbolism of 1,300 candles lit in Tel Aviv shows the sheer scale of the loss and the trauma. The well-known Hebrew writer Edgar Keret wrote last week, "You have a really big chunk of people who their life either stopped or changed forever. Each of them is surrounded by 100 people, his family, his friend, his partner, his parents. It's as if the entire country is in post-traumatic disorder." Thank you.
Hey, I'm Professor Michael Weingrad. I teach modern Jewish literature. You have a handout, I believe, with two texts, a story and a poem. I realize I barely have time to talk about one, so I won't talk about the poem today, just present an introduction to the story. Jews make great targets. There are a number of reasons for this, but I'll point out two. One reason is that Jews are a tiny group. There are around 14 billion Jews in the world today. That's less than 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. So there simply aren't that many Jews to resist whatever their enemies might want done to them. A second reason why the Jews are a great target is something we see dramatized in the story, The Shabbos Goy, in your handout. A story written in Warsaw in 1894 by the great Yiddish writer Yud Lamed Peretz. In this story, a Jew named Yankala goes to see the rabbi of his town. Now, Peretz was an avant-garde writer, a modernist, but what he often did was to take the tropes of traditional religious folk tales and imbue them with secular or ironic content. So here in the story, we have what at first seems like a traditional story about a Jew going to seek advice and wisdom from his rabbi, but it turns out to be something a bit different. Yankala's face is a bloody mess. He tells the rabbi that the Shabbos Goy punched him in the mouth. Now, here I need to explain what the Shabbos Goy or Sabbath Gentile is. Traditional Jewish Sabbath observance involves a range of rules and restrictions on activity. For instance, Jews can't turn on a stove on the Sabbath. But these Sabbath rules only apply to Jews. There are rules in traditional Judaism that are supposed to apply to all human beings. For instance, the rule not to murder. But Sabbath restrictions are a specifically Jewish obligation, which means that a non-Jew can turn on a stove. So there's a long history of Jewish and Christian interactions surrounding Sabbath arrangements. And in some Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, there was even a kind of official position of the Sabbath Gentile, the Shabbos Goy, in which a Christian was paid a salary by a Jewish community to do things like turn on a stove on the Sabbath so that food could be warmed. It's an interesting institution because it took place in an environment, as we heard from Professor Mayer's presentation, in which the majority Christian culture was sometimes violently hostile towards Jews. Yet this institution shows a measure of Jewish trust in non-Jews, a relationship with a Christian who enters Jewish homes precisely during the day of rest and holidays, when in some ways Jews are most vulnerable. In Peretz's story, the Shabbos Goy tells Yankala to open his mouth. When he does so, the Shabbos Goy punches him, knocking out 3 of his teeth. Yankala runs to the rabbi to warn him about this violent act of the Shabbos Goy. But the rabbi is focused on why the Shabbos Goy knocked Yankala's teeth out, and he is convinced that there must be a reasonable answer. The rabbi examines the knocked out teeth and notes they look quite healthy and strong. And so he tells Yankala the following. I'm just going to read a section from the middle of page 133 on the handout. He pauses to catch his breath and expounds, this is the rabbi speaking, "The guilt, Yankala, in reality belongs to your teeth." Yankala leaps up to his full height. "How is it possible, Rebbe? My teeth and the goy? Wholly innocent he is not, Yankala. That's not what I'm saying. The basic fault, however, lies in the teeth. That is to say, not your teeth." "What do you mean?" "Listen with attention, Yankala. By nature, the goy is an amiable creature. He was eating pumpkin seeds. He saw you. He really wanted to be hospitable and give you some. So open your mouth, he says, and wants to throw nuts into it. After all, they're fond of doing favors and little tricks. But when you, Yankala, obeyed and he saw such fine teeth, that is to say, his teeth in your mouth, you understand, a goy and his teeth in your mouth. So naturally, he becomes excited. And since he's a goy, what else can he do when he gets excited? So he hits out with his fist." What this story is revealing and critiquing is a second reason why Jews make great targets. A characteristic modern Jewish political response to being attacked is not to counterattack or to hit back, but to rationalize and even to take responsibility for the attack against them. What was it about my teeth that made you knock them out? How can I reassure you that my teeth mean you no harm? There is a history to the formation of this, in many ways, really quite bizarre political response. It's, I think, a secularization of the pre-modern Jewish religious understanding of catastrophe as a punishment from God. If troubles befall a Jewish community in pre-modern Jewish thinking, it's because they have sinned and God is correcting them. That framework may be hard for us to swallow today, but it had the advantage for pre-modern Jews of making the world intelligible and giving them moral agency, since they could correct their behavior and thereby avoid further misfortune. In the modern period, though, the religious framework drops out, but the psychological centering of the self as the root of the problem remains. What did I do that caused you to attack me? Furthermore, this mindset is reinforced by modern political ideologies of both liberalism and progressivism. In liberalism, human beings are fundamentally rational creatures, and therefore conflicts must be rational and solvable. The Shabbos Goy must have good reason to attack Yankala, and their misunderstanding can be solved, presumably by an equitable distribution of teeth. In progressivism or leftism, human interactions are usually relationships between oppressors and oppressed. If Yankala had his teeth knocked out, then he deserved it. They were oppressive teeth. University campuses, which today have become overwhelmingly left-wing and liberal, with really very few other philosophical or ideological perspectives permitted, make it very difficult, if not impossible, to conceptualize the critique embedded in Peretz's story. So in that story, the rabbi tells Yankala to go home and not make a fuss, and next time, not to provoke the Shabbos Goy by opening his mouth. I encourage you to read the story. It's just a few pages. And if you do, you'll find out what happens next and how the rabbi's strategy works out. And I think you'll find much resonance, not only for Jews in Peretz's time, but for behavior by Jews and non-Jews today. Thank you. Great. I'm happy to, I'll facilitate questions if people want to pass any questions on the question sheets to me. I will direct them to my colleagues and myself. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so one question we have is, excuse me, in regards to the trauma inflicted on October 7th, how might such an act of aggression on such a wide scale impact the movement of preserving a Jewish state? Will such an assault on a collective sense of security inform Zionism going forward? I think I want to direct this question to you, Professor Spiegel.
At the time that the massacre happened on October 7th, it was coming after numerous months that I'm sure many of you were following in the news of protests in Israeli society against parts of the government and against this potential judicial reform. This was a very challenging time in Israeli society where lots of questions were taking place around what their future was going to be, what it was going to hold, what direction was the country moving in. Security, what's been known as the security framework, even before the October 7th massacre, has always been at the center of Israeli, the Israeli mindset, a part of Israeli culture, this security ethos, going back a little bit to what I was describing with Masada, that sense of not wanting to be in an undefendable place again, and really being focused on having strong security. There's so much that is unknown right now about what the future will hold, and I'm certainly not a foreseer of that. One thing that I can tell you, if we look back to the Yom Kippur War, of which this massacre on October 7th took place at the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, there were major shifts in Israeli society after that war. The two are very, very different. But there are already starting to be signs of some changes within Israeli society. I think, interesting when we go looking at trauma that I didn't have the time to put into my talk for today is a lot of psychologists talk about looking for the helpers. Who are the helpers in any given traumatic situation? And one of the things we see in Israeli society today is so many people across different swaths of Israeli society, different religions, some of the migrant workers that I was mentioning earlier. There are so many different, both heroic and inspiring stories of seeking to help in any way possible. And so one of the things we see, for example, is that the network that was created among those who were protesting the potential judicial reforms in Israeli society has now banded together to help distribute food and supplies to those in need, to help try to use some of their technological skills to help try to find and locate and help with the hostages. And there's a lot of really inspiring things taking place in Israeli social society, Israeli civil society. I just forgot one thread that I wanted to mention regarding the Yom Kippur War. In the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War actually was the rise of feminism in Israeli society. It had started earlier, but it really took on a new life in the 1970s. It was a wake-up call to the society when all of the men were going to fight the battle. Nothing was running. There were no buses. The society was not functioning, and that became a wake-up call for the feminist movement. So I think we don't know yet what the sea changes are going to be in Israeli society, but I do expect that we will see some big shifts similar to the kinds of shifts we started to see in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
If I could just add a couple things to that. Professor Spiegel's the expert on Israeli society, but I'll just say that just anecdotally, what I've been hearing on Israeli media for the past few weeks is that, as you can imagine, a society under attack, which Israeli society sees itself as being, there's a tremendous sense of solidarity and of kind of banding together, but and Professor Spiegel earlier pointed out that Israeli society is incredibly diverse and that 20% of Israelis are not Jewish. And according to all reports, it is all of Israeli society that has been banding together and pitching in over the past few weeks. That includes Palestinian Israelis, that includes people who belong to the Druze minority, a religious minority who are ethnically Arab, and it includes Bedouins in the South. And that's pretty remarkable for a society that has been really riven over the past, especially the past few years. Tremendously riven, but politically, but also along ethnic and religious fault lines. And the fact that everyone feels that they want to pitch in and that this is a combined national effort tells us something about at least the short-term impact that the massacre has had on Israeli society. Obviously, no way to tell how things will play out even in the coming weeks, because everything is kind of these days is day to day. But it's worth taking note of.
So one of the questions that was asked is, understanding the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israelis on October 7th, how do you view Israel's response? Do you feel that it is proportionate? How do we reconcile the two actions while holding grace for the lives lost in both Israel and Palestine? So I'm actually not going to answer this question directly, because I just sort of want to point out an important distinction here, which is that when we stand up as scholars of Jewish studies, because it's an academic discipline, it's not appropriate for us all the time to talk about what we personally believe. I can talk to a little bit about what Jews believe right now and what Jews are thinking right now. And I can say that Jews and Israelis are responding to these atrocities in a variety of different ways that run the gamut from, you know, anger and calls for retribution to, you know, soul searching and self-blame, right? So there's a huge variety of ways that Jews are assessing the response to the recent events, right? And what I personally think is not something that is appropriate within an academic discussion. I think it's appropriate for us to talk about the varieties of ways of response. Personally, one of the reasons why I chose to speak about redemption of captives is that I think this is an important Jewish value that is both sort of feeding anxieties, but also has policy implications as well, right? But again, when we talk in the field of Jewish studies, my personal opinions aren't really the subject of inquiry. So thank you for your questions. I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything to you.
In the meantime, are there other questions?
Do you want to add it?
No, I don't think I want to add to that. These are extremely difficult questions, and obviously when faculty venture out of our niches, and even when we are in our niches, we're human beings, and not always sources of expertise, as I think many of you know. But here's another question that I think is a very a pressing and humane question, and we'll see if we can give any kind of response to it. What are your considerations for how Jewish students could cope with their grief? I have become a beacon and representative of an entire country halfway across the globe, not including coping with anxiety and loss. I'll make one comment about that, but I certainly think my colleagues will speak to this better than I can. But Jewish identity is very complex. Jews are we're a transnational group. I am a Jew. I spent most of the last year in Israel, which is a place that I love. I love the Mediterranean lifestyle. I love getting to have conversations about everything under the sun in Hebrew. I love my friends. I love the cultures from around the world that all gather there and mix. I love the art life. I love live music. I love the food. And so I do clearly have a very strong relationship with a nation and a state. At the same time, I'm an American. I'm an American Jew, and I live here. And that I think very often Jews themselves are perplexed and confused and debate how to handle this very complex kind of identity. So I think that's the first point that I want to make about this.
One thing that I would say is that that is an excellent question, but it's also a kind of a heartrending question, because I'm sorry that any student, in this case, a Jewish student, should feel that they have to kind of represent a state. You know, I mean, as Professor Weingrad pointed out, Jews have all kinds of relationships with Israel, and I mean, for that matter, even Israelis who are here on campus should not have to represent this a state, right? That I mean, no one should be in that position. And it's we know that there are Muslim students on campus who feel uneasy right now, and they should not also have to stand in for all of Islam or for any one particular group. So all of this is to say that if someone comes up to you and says, well, explain to me what Israel is doing now, you don't have to answer that question. You can just say, I don't speak for Israel and I have a complicated relationship with it, or whatever the case may be. Or you can actually just say, I don't need to answer that question either. But I think that it's important for students to know that you do not have to be put into that position. Nobody really needs to be put into that position. And so I think that that's worth stating pretty clearly and making sure that everyone is aware of that. We have a couple minutes left. I think Professor Weingrad is collecting a few more questions.
Can I just add one
please do. Yeah.
one more comment to that very excellent question, which is that one of the ways in which Jews have been dealing with this particular point in history is the way that Jews have always dealt with this point in history, which is engaging with Judaism more deeply. And that can mean lots of different things. It can mean doing so with a critical lens. It can mean engaging with traditional Jewish texts. It can mean engaging with Jewish thinkers. And so I think that's another sort of way of at least sort of positively connecting to aspects of your Jewish identity in a time when other people might be seeking to undermine that.
And I just also wanted to encourage students to get support. There are, one of the really critical aspects, as you saw from my talk about trauma on the individual level as well, is that feeling of aloneness. And I think it's a really important time for students to get support. There's a variety of different avenues on campus, and part of why we wanted to do this talk today was to give context in the hopes of also opening up the conversation. The ideal of the university is to have a safe space to talk. And that was certainly a big goal that we have for today. And we want to encourage you to keep talking and to keep looking for support. There's a lot of inspiring people out there, even in the midst of all of the darkness. And I want to encourage you to find them and to find that light.
Well, we have some really great questions that just came up, and we have about a minute left. Let's try to bring together a couple of them. There was a question that links the anti-Semitic calls for the dehumanization and destruction of Jews with language and calls from the Israeli government, which says similar things about the dehumanization and destruction of another group of people. So obviously our focus today is trying to understand Jewish responses and the Israeli government's response is also certainly in a way a Jewish response, can be understood in the light of Jewish history. This is a tough one. I would say that the official line of Israeli governments, or let me put it another way, there has never been an official Israeli governmental policy or a line calling for the destruction of the Palestinians as a people. There have been many different approaches to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by different governments. I'm not talking about what individual politicians say, because there are individual politicians who Israeli politicians who have said hateful things and who I would call racists. That exists within Israeli society, and I don't think, and I certainly for one would never try to deny that. But I think we need to make a distinction between what Hamas calls for, which is the destruction of Israel, and an Israeli governmental policy, which has, as I said, has varied a great deal over the decades, It has at times, right, there has been, this is difficult for people to remember, but there was a peace process at one point. At other times, much more antagonistic, you might say, but never, I think I'm right in saying this, never calling for the outright destruction of the Palestinian people. Michael, do you want to say something
I
as well?
just wanted to add the poem that I did not talk about. I added because I think it's a voice that we're probably not going to hear, and that it, in many ways is even silenced or marginalized within Israel itself. It's written about as some of you will know, there were around 8,000 Jews living in Gaza before Israel withdrew from Gaza entirely in 2005. And so I had recently translated a poem about the destruction by the Israeli government of these Jewish communities that had been there. So I included that poem not because I necessarily agree with what may be the political implications of it, but just as a way of understanding that through literature, through learning more, we may discover very, very different and sometimes surprising perspectives on what's happening here. It doesn't, not binaries, not things that are simply reducing to black and white, but things, even if we may not agree or we find that they are challenging or provocative, are worth entertaining, are worth absorbing, are worth listening to. And in that connection, I really want to recommend one response to these events as learning more. My three colleagues in the department and our Hebrew professor, Moshe Rahmut, are wonderful, wonderful teachers. They create an incredible, rich, challenging, and very engaged intellectual environment in their classrooms. So I encourage you to take their classes. I also teach. And
he's a good teacher too.
Thank you. I will mention that I'm not on our current course flyers, but in the spring, I'm going to be offering a new course on the Jewish graphic novel in both Israel and France. So for those of you who might be interested in that subject, keep an eye out for that later on.
Okay, thanks. Listen, I know I'm sorry we're not able to get to all the questions. Our time is pretty limited today, and some of the last questions came to me just in the last couple minutes. So I'm sorry we weren't able to get into as full a discussion as possible relating to the questions that folks asked, but these are all excellent questions. And as Professor Weingrad just said, we want you to just keep learning about this. Make sure that you open yourself to a wide a range of perspectives on this conflict as possible. And thank you all for coming and being willing to learn about this. We all appreciate it very much.